Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to see a full auditorium for this global lecture on global culture, the last of this season. I'm Michael Schindhelm. We are talking tonight about the Sigg collection on contemporary Chinese art under a specific aspect. It's the second time that I have invited Uli Sigg to this series. 2 years ago, it was pretty new that Uli Sigg had decided to give a major part of his collection to Hong Kong, to the development of the M+ Museum in the city of Hong Kong. In the meantime, 2 years later, the museum is already under construction. We may also speak about this tonight. But I think there was, during the last years, a lot to say about the Sigg collection and Uli Sigg. Most of you have probably read here and there about his work, about his mission, so to say. And I think it's worth to, this time, looking after something more specific in his work than last time when we gave a kind of general overview about his efforts during the last 30 years. Just briefly to remind you, I think most of you have heard of Uli Sigg before. He was born in 1946, and among many other things he did, he in fact studied law before he became a journalist, but he was also a rower, at some point even for the national team, if I'm not mistaken, in Switzerland. And I think the rowing never ended, although he changed several times afterwards his profession. He at some point joined the multinational company Schindler and forged, which was probably instrumental to all what he did afterwards, forged the first joint venture between Western Corporation and Red China in 1979, when he became the vice president of Schindler China. And he was probably one of the first foreigners coming to China after the end of the Cultural Revolution, after Mao's death, experiencing this tremendous change, and you could even say to some extent contributed substantially to the making of this new society by introducing market economy as one of the first individuals who at that time arrived in China in this kind of position, and I think this is really a great contribution. He stayed in this position for 12 years until the beginning of the 90s, and then started his own business for a few years, and then something happened which maybe is only possible in a country like Switzerland, because in 1995 suddenly the at that time Minister for Foreign Affairs approached him, Mr. Coty, and asked him if he would accept to become the ambassador to Beijing without having any kind of educational background in the fields of diplomacy. So he accepted this position and became the ambassador to China, Mongolia, and North Korea for the next 4 years, from 1995 to 1998. And again, this was a very important step in what unfolded afterwards, which was that Uli Sigg became maybe one of, if not the first, at least one of the very first collectors of contemporary Chinese art. Just quoting one of the most renowned curators today, Hans Ulrich Obrist, who at that time visited Uli Sigg as ambassador for the first time in 1996 or so. The Swiss ambassador, the Swiss embassy at that time in Beijing was maybe the first museum of contemporary Chinese art, and at the same time a kind of salon for all sorts of intellectuals and artists who were invited by Uli Sigg at that time, and his wife Rita, who is present tonight too, by the way, who hosted the first probably events of that kind, which allowed an exchange between many Westerners, not only Swiss people, and Chinese artists, not only artists but also intellectuals, scientists, etc. So that was probably a very interesting, exciting moment for Swiss diplomacy in general, and of course for you in particular. Uli Sigg started out in his investigation in contemporary Chinese art at a time when nobody actually knew what is there, what kind of art is created in China today, how many artists, what kind of artists, how do they differentiate by generations, etc. So there were no media, of course, there was almost no knowledge whatsoever when Uli Sigg started to research in the country, to meet artists, to visit informal exhibitions or informal gatherings of artists in the late 90s. He became friend with most of these very famous artists of today, among them, for example, Ai Weiwei. Many of these people became mentors, to many of these people, Uli Sigg became a mentor who introduced those artists to international museums, curators, media, galleries. So he was also very important for the dissemination of contemporary Chinese art over the last 20 years in our countries. For example, in the late 90s, he invited Harald Szeemann to come to China and go with him on a travel throughout the country. And he introduced Szeemann to many contemporary artists at that time. Up front, Szeemann's Biennale in 1999 in Venice. So, as you may know, Szeemann decided in 1999 to open the Arsenale as part of the parcours of the Biennale, and opened it with an entirely Chinese program, which was really unprecedented at that time, introducing more than 20 artists from China to an international audience. Uli Sigg became, over time, and after he returned to Switzerland even more so, the largest collector of contemporary Chinese art in the world. And as I mentioned in the beginning, in 2012, after many attempts to convincing the central government in Beijing that they should actually at some point accept a donation of the collection back to China, which all failed. Unfortunately, the Chinese government declined those offers for reasons we may talk about later. Uli Sigg finally decided to give this major part of his collection to Hong Kong and to a museum which is going to be built over the next years, actually designed by Herzog & de Meuron, a Swiss architectural firm. So he became, over the last 20 years, probably one of the very, very few experts on contemporary Chinese art from a Western country, known and asked for advice in many countries, in many major institutions. He sits on the advisory boards of major institutions in America and in Europe today, advising them on how to collect and to curate Chinese contemporary art in those museums. And of course, he is still in touch with China. He's traveling there very often. He's in touch with many, many artists. So we speak about somebody who has, on the one hand, created an enormous legacy, but it's not finished. He still keeps going on. And I think there's one major dimension which is often forgotten when people speak about your work. And this is that on the one hand, you're probably a very particular collector, but at the same time, you always saw yourself as somebody in a kind of public, let's say, position, or with a public mission, trying to interact with public audiences about your work and about your collection all over the place. And this is probably something we should talk about today in greater detail, that you not only collected art for yourself, but you actually collected it for public audiences to disseminate the knowledge you gained over the last 20, 25 years in China, also in Western countries. And you managed to collaborate on that subject with many Western institutions, and you were able also to support or to enable exhibitions in Switzerland, but also in other countries. And therefore, we gave this lecture the title, The Sigg Collection and its Public Intermediation. So Uli, the floor is yours for the next 40 minutes or so, and afterwards we'll have a conversation among ourselves and also with you, of course. Thank you for coming.
Good evening, everyone. I will have a hard time to live up to this very kind introduction. I will try. This is our topic today. Michael asked me to bring a lot of images. I did. And I will take you through a few stations of the development of Chinese contemporary art. We have to do that in order to then talk about the intermediation, which is a consequence of the status of Chinese contemporary art over time. This is how it all started. That's the pre-contemporary art in China, socialist realism in style and in content. The artists had no possibility to do anything but that. The works were commissioned by government, by local governments, by bureaucracy, and it's important because here all artists had to work to a certain code. What needs to be represented in an image? It's the worker, the woman, the aged people, the young people, rosy cheeks, even the colors were coded, and of course this delight in building the new China, as we may possibly see in a moment. The Chinese artists, having now found a very limited degree of freedom after the breakdown of the Mao era, they tried all these styles that, here in this Tony building, the artists will learn about, like expressionism, impressionism, abstract formalism type things. So if I looked at the Chinese art in the very first years, it was all about that, not so exciting. So for that reason, I didn't collect yet. Here we move on to like 1985, 86. In the meantime, Chinese artists had found to their own language after emulating all these Western styles. And here we see a work where a Chinese artist experiments with ink painting, which is the true Chinese tradition. And what's interesting about this work, it's a very large work. The artist produced it for an exhibition for a congress of writers that because of this work, this exhibition was closed down. The Academy felt that an audience cannot see this kind of destruction, demolition of Chinese ink painting, something very, very hard to imagine today. So at that time, after a very short window of time, end of the 70s, very first 80s, the artists were actually pushed into the underground and had to work in a very difficult environment. We come closer to the late 80s. I will not comment on every single image. This now is where the art became overtly political. It's one of the first Mao portraits. Mao here is behind the grid. This grid served to define the Mao painting. There were like 8 official portraits allowed. They were all defined by a grid so that every artist all over the People's Republic would paint Mao in the proper respectful manner. So he put this grid on top of the Mao face, and so, well, is he behind the grid? This painting, of course, caused big trouble. Then we had 89, events in 89. They were very decisive for the further development of Chinese contemporary art. The artists sort of resignated after 89. They had lost their newly found half freedom completely, while during the 80s they had this big topics of building this new society to which they wanted to contribute in mind. They start to think about their individual situation. They closed down. Many artists were in deep crisis, couldn't create. And here we have such a, well, youngster with this rebellious type bald head, sees the old China moving up here. More such images. The period was called political realist cynicism, cynical realism, sorry. Very complicated. It's cool because they used like Western metaphors, like you may know this painting from the French Revolution. So that created what then became very famous in the West. Actually, these are the paintings that we associate with Chinese contemporary art, mainly this cynical realism, pop-type works. And they are the ones which found their way also in the Western art market. And this is just one example of maybe the most successful artist in the market. He sold the most, or not he, but in auction, his most expensive painting reached $25 million US. Then we saw more of new media work or more progressive work. We would also in the West start to consider as interesting art. Like here is a performance as a relatively new form at the time. The artist throwing this red pigment into this river from Mao's birthplace into the seas, blood running through the Chinese nation. Here is an artist working with the environment. It's the first work I ever saw dealing with the Chinese environment. This woman froze the water from a local river. We see how dirty it is, and had the local inhabitants clean their own water. They clean the ice, which is gradually melting. Here we have a work by Ai Weiwei, a Han Dynasty urn, a couple of thousand years old, and he drew the Coca-Cola logo. This marked the period where consumerism really reached China. In the 80s, still quite restricted in that respect, but in the 90s, the consumerism really took off and therefore found its reflection and its mirroring in the art scene. That was the time when I had, seen a lot of Chinese artists, a lot of Chinese art, and I felt there is so much interesting art, but in the Western world, nobody pays attention to it. This is hard to imagine today, but in hindsight, this was the situation. So I was thinking of a way to provide this attention I thought the Chinese artists would deserve in the Western world. And the vehicle I set up at the time is this Chinese Contemporary Art Award. I was thinking this would allow me to collect a lot of material from Chinese artists. At that time, China had no transparency in the art. There was no internet, there were no books, because the art was predominantly in the underground. And so I thought of a way to contribute to a domestic discussion about contemporary art, which was so limited and restricted to very few academic circles, really. And in particular, how I could have important Western curators see the Chinese art. So I thought through this art award, I could invite them into a jury, and then they would see a lot of Chinese art and subsequently include it in their projects. It was not so much who is winning or who is the winner, but they would see these works and then show them to the Western world, because at that time it's gradually changing. The gatekeepers to the contemporary art were all Western people. And for China, for Chinese artists, it was extremely difficult to get some attention and find a way. And actually in '89, the exhibition Magicien de la Terre in Paris was the first time that artists from developing countries, or what we would today call emerging countries, got a stage in the Western world of significance. So, as Michael already explained, this led to Harald Szeemann bringing a lot of Chinese artists to that particular Venice Biennale in '99. And that then led to a situation where that large Western audience had to look at the Chinese art. There were Chinese exhibitions in the West before, but they were small. They were in small institutions done by and visited by specialists and China freaks and sinologists. And the broad public, for the first time in '99, took notice of Chinese contemporary art. Their reactions were very interesting in that most of the professional people in the art world said, we don't think this is going to stay. This may be like the Russian art in the '80s. We don't need to really learn about this phenomenon. And some said, this looks so Chinese, and others said, it doesn't look Chinese. And I had many, many interesting conversations about Chinese contemporary art at the time. But later, it proved to be very important to create a market. Here are just some images that later came into collection. They deal with these phenomena, Chinese society, and it all led up, these various works, then led up to this exhibition in Bern. We talk about now the intermediation part, and I was always trying to find a forum for the art in the Western world, and actually was the Kunstmuseum Bern, which was the first one to offer me such kind of forum. And here again are more works that then were seen in this particular exhibition in Bern. It was a kind of overview exhibition, the first, one could say, worldwide, which laid out a very large spectrum of Chinese art creation. So these are the different media. We see installation, photo, performances, objects of all kinds, like a fat pillar, human fat, what have you. Or this is a very moving 3-channel video installation where it deals with this method of bringing people to death, sentenced to death by 10,000 cuts, skinning the people, giving them a drug, so they, according to what is believed, them almost enjoying the process. So these are very, very Chinese works which require some context knowledge to be fully understood, and that is really the big issue when it comes to the exhibitions of contemporary Chinese art. So here is the book. In the end, the book is what remains of an exhibition. Here's the book for the Bern exhibition, and that was the book as we wanted to publish it. Yet the publisher felt we cannot win any readers, any audience with this gray type book and landscape. We need, ideally, a girl on the cover. Actually, that was their first choice, but I asked them if, this is their choice, maybe at least take a better painting, which is this one. But then in Salzburg, the publisher decided for the next exhibition in Salzburg, this particular photo. So it indicates some of the issues when it comes to acceptance or reception of a Western audience of China. There are certain cliches, and they have to be attended to. This led to discussions, in particular in China, this exhibition. While in the West, the people were extremely impressed and said, we had no idea the Chinese artists work such a broad spectrum, all media, all kinds of things, contemporary, traditional. Chinese curators or a part of the Chinese academics felt this is catering to the Western taste, this exhibition. The art is political, nobody has an understanding for the tradition, and so very often the Chinese exhibitions have to deal with this kind of prejudice. Why does it happen? It's Western curators who select for their audience, and they may often lack this context knowledge of the Chinese tradition in particular. They may select for their audience what deals with political issues, human rights, etc., etc. So a large part of the Chinese art production, although it's in the collection, never found its way to a public. So here are some more such type of overview exhibitions. They were necessary at the time because nobody had much of a clue what the Chinese artists were doing. This was in Ireland. This was in Brazil. Actually, this exhibition drew 500,000 people, amazing. And in most institutions, this show had the largest or one of the largest audience they ever had for contemporary. Of course, it cannot match, the big impressionist masters, etc. But when it comes to contemporary, during the 90s, during the early 2000s, these exhibitions drew a large crowd. Here was one in the Miro Foundation in Barcelona. Here are just some works we added. They were variations in the Mahjong exhibitions, overview exhibitions, defined by the space, possibilities, and the size of the institution. Here is one we did in Berkeley, in San Francisco. And it was very interesting to see the differences in reception, in curating, and in the sense of what is permissible. And I found, for instance, that in Berkeley, even though University City, San Francisco, the political correctness was such that they were as restrictive as maybe an exhibition in China would be. And they stayed away from everything that is overtly sexual. They stayed away from issues like dealing with animals. It was very interesting to see the various frames to do exhibitions. Like the first question dominating each press conference, each presentation there was, how many women artists in this exhibition? It was really striking to see that everybody focused on this particular question. So that's just some notions of different reactions. That was an exhibition, then traveled to the Peabody Essex Museum, that's near Boston. It's a museum that has some 60,000 porcelain artifacts, export porcelain from China, biggest in the world. So they were very interested in going into contemporary. And this is the most recent of these overview exhibitions. This was in Sweden. Scandinavia never had a large Chinese contemporary art exhibition. So this is in this new museum in Umeå. And this is the exhibition that will be the first one rolled out in Hong Kong about the collection. There it's called now the M+Sigg collection. There is a discussion right now, can this be the cover? You may remember there is a photo of the 89 incident on Tiananmen, and there are people carrying the dead students on this tricycle through the Tiananmen place, and of course this alludes to this. And so in the Chinese space, issues like that start to surface. Here is another typology, or another type in the typology of collections. We now talked about the big overview exhibitions. Then the requirements were more for smaller exhibitions, which would focus on, for instance, the geography. So this is like contemporary art from Guangzhou, which we did in Bern. Here some images, like this work deals with the position of the girl as the disadvantaged part of the society, the status of the rural girl. This is an exhibition about art from Shanghai. There is surprisingly quite a number of artists who worked with traditional media. Then there is another type of exhibition, the one I personally like best. It's a kind of deep drill about a subject, using the collection as material, but in-depth treatment of, like here, landscape in Chinese contemporary art. Landscape is one of the pillars of the Chinese tradition. The tradition, actually, calligraphy and landscape painting are the embodiment of the Chinese tradition. And so it was therefore very interesting from my perspective to do an exhibition about that part. How do contemporary artists deal with this tradition? In the 80s, with very few exceptions, they had no interest at all in the tradition. They just wanted to deal with the Western concepts and conceptual art and the like. We saw some examples. But over the last few years, more and more artists turn back to their tradition. They feel somehow disillusioned by all these Western concepts. They feel the Western art doesn't provide all the answers, and they may just be, they may be lucky and find new inspiration in their own tradition. Here is a work I developed together with the artist. We were thinking of how could we create a work that maybe a young generation who doesn't care about old scrolls would take a new look at their own tradition. And we developed it on the computer together. Actually, this artist, very excited, one day called me. He told me he has a new software, the Bryce software, which allows to represent a Chinese perspective in a painting, which is not the central perspective. This has many reasons. One, these are scrolls, the Chinese traditional painting. If you would use the central perspective, as we did after Middle Age, you could never see a whole painting because you roll it up on one end and you close it on the other end. So this new software allowed us to create such a painting together. And so there are many such, notions in. This is another image of this exhibition, was in Lucerne. So those of you who may know the Lucerne Museum, there is the lake intruding into the museum, and we had this projection from the 5th floor where the museum is. So up there was this music instrument, and you could play it, and that would then trigger a projection on the water. So it was a kind of interactive way to play around with landscape. Here's another such landscape work digitally produced. This is a scholar rock made from silicone as another medium. The scholar rock having a very important place in tradition. Here is an image of the calligraphy garden, as it's called. The artist making fun of the Chinese garden. Calligraphy is under this bridge, and there's even a massage machine in there which make this pond, as it's supposed to be, move like waves, and there's this waterfall in this back corner, etc. So this type of exhibition is about the subject going deeper, and it should show like the various attitudes of the artist toward their own tradition. In this particular case, like we see some works are very critical about the tradition, others make fun of the tradition, others feel they are within this tradition, need to write forth the tradition. So we have all these attitudes. Then we have an exhibition that was in the National Portrait Gallery in Australia about portraiture. It was actually an opportunity for me to learn what the portrait gallery is. You may know or may not know. I thought it's about portraits, but actually it's about national heroes being portrayed. So here is this exhibition in that particular gallery. This is about old men and old ideas ruling the world today. So these are wheelchairs, and they all are, driving around, and you could even walk through them. This is actually an original microphone from the 40s, and we hear Mao's voice declaring the People's Republic as being founded, and various other things. Here's another kind of deep drill about the tradition. I mentioned the second pillar is the calligraphy. So here is how the contemporary artists see calligraphy. And we have, again, all kinds of media. This is a kind of explosion drawing almost of a chair, but it is, for the Chinese, like a character. This is the true type, although contemporary ink painting, although invented characters. This is a very strange work. It's an archive, as it's called. The artist collected the documents that the security bureau of a large city had assembled from 49 to 79. They were destined to be burnt, and he could get a hold of them. So we installed this whole archive with the old furniture, and it's just amazing. This material would need the research. It's like reports of neighbors saying, well, today my neighbor at 3 o'clock still received a guest, and he said something disrespectful about Mao, or these are opened letters, photographed. It's incredible material. This is from an artist who is now in the Hong Kong Pavilion at the Venice Biennial. It's an installation which is very dynamic. These letters drop from the walls. It's not possible to show it in a static image. This is a large work where the artist took the Chinese so-called alphabet, officialized signs. It's 3,400 signs, first category. The other one's in a computer. I also developed it with him because I wondered what makes it into a computer, because longer term only these signs will persist. Everything else will be forgotten in the next few years already. And also there are a number of issues like children. How do children learn the Chinese characters? You need to acquire knowledge of thousands of characters just to read a newspaper. What does it mean? What does it mean for the, say, more disadvantaged or less gifted child, etc.? So we dealt with a lot of these issues in this particular exhibition. Then a few images of what's happening now. We, like a lot of artists now deal with abstraction in a different way. Like this artist create hundreds and hundreds of layers in an image, every day new layer. So they are very process oriented now. Then There is still political art, even though much less than in the past. This work, 10 Mayors in the Grassland, shows the people who really govern China today. You know, it's the male in the 50s and a little bit overweight, very self-confident. Well, we only see a part of them, maybe better. Then we have a lot of interactive works, like this particular work by Cao Fei. It's R&B City. It's actually in Second Life, this particular work. It's a big, big work where she created a city. And in the city, if you create your own avatar, you can move around. Actually, I was the first mayor of R&B City. We created exhibitions in buildings in here, which you can visit, etc., etc. So the Chinese art is also very versatile in these new media things. Here is what we have in the planning stage as a next exhibition. Will be in Bern, museum in Bern, next February. The Kunstmuseum Bern plus the Clay Museum, they both will do their first project together. So it will be a very large exhibition of all the things that were added to the collection after Mahjong. It's really an exhibition deals with what happened with the exhibition after Mahjong. So here are some works that will appear there, like this tank project. It's made from leather. The artist imported from Italy, Gucci and the like, and he created this big, big, big tank. We see here a detail. Every single detail is made out of this luxury leather. It's really an amazing work. So we see a lot of Chinese art is about size. This was an undertaking of some 2 years, 30 people. I mean, this just to create this tank after drawings from a real Chinese model. Paintings, we will see paintings. So here we turn now to, very briefly, to the M+ Museum that will house the collection, or say a substantial part of the collection. Will be built in Hong Kong. Will have some 60,000 square meters. It's very large. It's bigger than Tate or MoMA. It will cost something like $900 million once completed. This has very much to do with Hong Kong itself, because construction costs in Hong Kong over these 5 years now, when they took the decision to build it, rose more than 100%. So it will be an expensive place. But this is where the collection will form the core of the M+ collection. So I think that's enough for a talk.
Thank you. Maybe just we exchange a few things about, let's say, quantities and more practical things about the collection. It's more than 2,200 pieces of art, mostly since, let's say, the 60s, but more of course, from the late 70s onwards until today, with a focus most likely on the time you yourself also spent in China most of the time, since 1979, during the 80s, during the 90s. You donated around 1,500 of those to Hong Kong 2 years ago. And that means that Hong Kong, this museum, at some point will host this part of the collection. What was actually behind this idea of donating such a big part, but on the other hand, not the whole thing?
The idea was to form a storyline from the beginnings of contemporary art and pre-contemporary art, like Cultural Revolution works, to today. So I chose, say, these works necessary to read this storyline across the timeline, across the media, how Chinese art developed. And it's actually the only collection in the world which allows to do that.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned already the museum is under construction, but it will take still quite some time before it's going to be completed, because this is now set for 2019. In other words, there are 5 more years to go. But there's already quite a serious exchange between the two museums. And I think the whole collection and its evolution, and maybe also unfolding during the next years, is a very, I would say, symptomatic example for cultural globalization, because we just this morning were at Uli Sigg's storage in a small village in the central Switzerland, and at the same time, in, let's say, the most dense populated place in the world, this collection is going to be on display in 5 years from now. And the artwork comes actually from the other China, where it has been created over 30, 40 years by somebody who, by, you may even say, coincidence, happened to live there during a certain period of time. So this combination of very different things, which on the one hand are very local, on the other hand very global, is an example for how complex cultural production and finally also collection of art is happening. But you have now some strategies agreed on together with the museum on how to handle this, because the collection is still here, but it is at the same time already owned by Hong Kong. There are already lendings, there are already exhibitions. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this?
But they give me a lot of work. Mm-hmm. Because Hong Kong cannot absorb the collection, they lack the infrastructure, the storage, so I have to keep it in our premises. And they are quite demanding in the sense that they would like to see a museum standard, but I cannot provide a museum standard. The storage facilities are actually quite good, and people are usually very impressed, but it's not climatized, to the very stable climate. It's not fixed on a 50% humidity, etc. So there are like slow variations, but they don't affect the works. But of course, it's not what a world-class museum would demand. And then they are still part of the Hong Kong administration. They haven't yet managed to become autonomous. So every few months I have some kind of inspection. Is everything there? Is something in the computer in the storage? Is something in the storage in the computer? If we ship something from A to B in Switzerland, I must have solicit 3 offers, but I may not even be able to find 3 people who want to ship or who want to send a painting from my storage to my home. So these are like the issues that we have to deal with. On the other hand, of course, they now do a lot of research, and they will create a very scientific foundation for the collection, and they are now, or we all are in the process of bringing it on the web in a very good manner. And I mean, there's a lot they also contribute. But our life is not easy. Mm-hmm.
But it was your choice anyway.
It's my choice.
You're not only working on storing and archiving, but you're already exhibiting together. Maybe you can talk a bit about this? Because I mentioned already some of the exhibitions like Hamburg about calligraphy or Bern for next year. Those are already a cooperation like a triangle, I understand.
Yeah, they combine works that are in the so-called N+6 collection, and there are works in my remaining collection. And so often it's a mix. That in itself poses less of a problem than sometimes the curators would, which are not part of N+, but to do exhibitions of Chinese contemporary art with Western curators is also not very easy.
Yeah, I would like to understand this better because I mentioned in the beginning already that you are also on advisory boards of international museums. Face value, you are not an art historian, right? You were a journalist, you were a businessman, you're still a businessman, and you wonder, of course, why somebody like this has to advise, let's say, the Guggenheim or Metropolitan Museum on Chinese art. But this is the case. So, do you, over the last, let's say, 1 or 2 decades, there's a recognition in Western countries and Western institutions on the importance of Chinese art, contemporary Chinese art in particular. Do you feel that the expertise is growing too, and do you see that this is a new generation of curators coming up, or in general another type of recognition, another type of knowledge having been developed or is under development?
Yeah, this is clearly the case. This has very much to do with globalization and art being ubiquitous, contemporary art being everywhere, and more people from emerging countries also joining the global art operating system. That does happen. But of course, you still, like if I talk about my own experience, in the Western countries, you still deal with very often with people who may not have the basic knowledge of Chinese contemporary art. This is quite normal. This is no value judgment. I mean, it's why should they? But then it's very difficult to create an exhibition because they bring their own experience, their own vision, their own interests. Then there is very often, aside from say this basic lack of Chinese contemporary art knowledge, a lack of context knowledge. I mean, these works are made in a certain context. They describe a certain political, social context. If you're not familiar with them, then you may make the wrong choices. And then there is a third element. It's your blind spot. We all have a blind spot, looking at other cultures in particular. And it's very important that we become aware of our own blind spot, which seems sometimes almost mutually exclusive. And I remember like discussions where a curator would tell me this work, it doesn't have the quality of my institutions to be exhibited. And I would ask him, yeah, but you can't even read a single character. It was like about a calligraphy work, So, how can you judge this particular work? Not being able to read and write, how can you contextualize it? And the response was, I studied art. I can look at art in any continent, in every country. I can see quality and the lack of quality. So you still can meet such kind of people. That's what I mean with a blind spot. So these are issues that you find in varying, differing degrees with curators.
You once explained to me that one of the major reasons why you started your interest in Chinese contemporary art was that at some point you felt you need another way to understand the society. And art was a witness, and therefore something to turn to in order to understand China in a different way. So that is something which was obviously a driving force for starting also collecting this art. But why did you actually, you mentioned also at some point that you understood your work as somebody who does this on behalf of a non-existing public institution, and you try to create a document about the development of contemporary Chinese art. In comparison to other collectors who would rather have their personal choice, you sort of try to say that you're not following your personal choice only, but you try to replace or to substitute a missing link between the art world and the public domain. Why did you do this, and why did you follow this path for such a long period?
It just so happened that I discovered. It just so happened that I discovered that nobody was collecting in any other but very random way Chinese contemporary art. In particular, no institution. And as you mentioned earlier, it's the biggest cultural space in the world. So, what will the people in 20 years from now think? What did our artists do in the 80s, 90s? They cannot find it. Mm-hmm. So I felt that if nobody creates this document, which is really the job of a national institution, then I tried to do it. Mm-hmm. I stress I tried to do it, mm-hmm. because no such document could ever be complete.
Mm-hmm. You finally decided to give it to Hong Kong. Maybe I can imagine that many artists who trusted that at some point, by giving the artwork to you and maybe selling it sometimes also at a, let's say, less expensive price, that you would at some point hand it over to a public institution, because that is of course the dream of an artist, not ending up just in private collections but rather in larger public museums. And there are now coming up those museums also in mainland China, so there were potentially destinations for this exhibition, for this collection also in Beijing, Shanghai, or maybe in the future also in other places. But you gave it to Hong Kong. Can you explain why?
My first impulse was to give it to Beijing or Shanghai, but the negotiations proved to be so complicated that in the end I decided for Hong Kong, because Hong Kong did just everything to get a hold of this collection. As we see here, they built this huge shell, but have no content. Mm. So for them, this was the opportunity to get content, and maybe the best content for a location like Hong Kong. Mm. And it makes them, in one instant, to the #1 place for Chinese contemporary art in the world. Mm. So for them, this was very important. Mm. While the Chinese institutions had many internal problems, because a lot of this art is political. If a cadre would decide to accept this donation, he most probably would end his career. Mm-hmm. Because although, the lower cadres, for instance, Ministry of Culture, the specialists can assess the importance of this collection, their superiors cannot, because they have had no exposure to contemporary art. They don't know what this is. To them, this art is made to a completely wrong paradigm. They know their tradition. They know Chinese traditional art, which is made to the paradigm of beauty, harmony, etc., etc. While the contemporary art is critical, mirrors society as it is, not as it ought to be, like they were used from the socialist realism, which drew a world as it ought to be. So to them, this type of art is strange, to say the least. So they much rather don't compromise their own career and would not accept such donation.
There are very serious voices in, let's say, the public domain, debating and questioning the political relevance of, or let's say even the social relevance of contemporary art, and decline of its relevance during the last, let's say, 10 to 20 years, in parallel to this enormous financial and market success of the same contemporary art. So there's this debate around, is art just following big money in the meantime, or does it still have something to say about what socially happens in our world? And is art more than just an investment or the enjoyment for the happy few who can afford skyrocketing prices? Or is it still something which has an important dimension for today and tomorrow in terms of social commentary or education? Do you think that the Chinese contemporary art will actually follow the same trends and becoming also very commercial, very mainstream? You mentioned already prices of some of the big stars who were also 10 years still living and working very humbly. You are still mentor of them. Or do you think that China, in the opposite way, may sort of disturb and change those trends?
There are many even contradicting currents. And of course, one is globalization and joining the mainstream. And we see the artists who led a distinctly different life in the past now leading same life like their peers in New York and London, and they have access to the internet, although right now it's very limited again, but they know what their peers are doing, they see the catalogs, they see the magazines, they travel, they are invited. So on one hand you see them leaving this distinctly different art and joining this global mainstream, and we don't know, will they just be swallowed up or will they maybe have an impact on this global mainstream? I mean, it's for us to see in the near future. But then you also have this kind of nationalist tune where China is trying to create its own contemporary art, which is different from this globalized art. And it has to be seen in this whole discussion of soft power, where they have now realized that contemporary art is an important factor. In the past, they have ignored it, and then they have realized that some strange foreigners like me, you know, in their view, have the power to determine what's meaningful and what's not meaningful Chinese art. So they try to get a hold of this discussion and to regain the authority on determining all this and on shaping the art according to, you know, a very different paradigm, let me put it this way. And there is a risk that it becomes, or they want to instrumentalize it as a political tool again. So the last 2 years have been very difficult for contemporary art in China.
Okay, so we would of course like to offer you also opportunities to ask questions. Please, floor is yours. We have also a microphone for you.
Mr. Sigg, you explained us the timeline that you want to show people, the development of contemporary art. What is the future? Will you go on collecting in the next 10 years and donating these works to the N+?
Well, I wish I knew if I survived the next 10 years. So I continue to collect Chinese contemporary art, but in a different way, not with the ambition to mirror the whole art production as I had in the past, but much more focused now on the things I take a personal interest. And then I also collect other things, but Chinese contemporary art.
That of course triggers the question, what are the other things?
Well, some is Asian art, and I have always taken an interest in the art of, say, emerging countries or emerging societies, although the societies have been there for long. So, yeah, it's a variety of Asian art, particularly, say, East Asian, Japanese, Korean, North Korean, because I was ambassador to North Korea, which is quite weird, and then some art beyond that, even Swiss art. So I don't know. I have some images, but it may not be of much interest. Talk about Chinese art.
Maybe this is then the third lecture on global culture. You speak about your collection on Swiss art at some point. More questions? Okay, it's first the gentleman there.
Thank you very much for the talk. You mentioned something very interesting, the art operating system. What does it mean?
The way I define it is this web of artist, gallerist, art critic, auction house, institution. This web, which is defined differently in almost each nation. That's what I mean by the art operating system. And I am an eager student of art operating systems in different continents, in different countries, under different systems.
There was somebody? Oh, okay.
I'm interested in learning more about this interaction between art and politics. From your point of view, how far is art a reflection of societal transformation, and how much is it actually transforming society? And so how is the interaction going on?
That's an eternal debate, how much of interaction there is, and it would be very different for each art operating system and each society. If we take a look at China, then my opinion is that the art reflects very well the trends in the Chinese society. Not a single work, but the sum of it. So if we would roll out the whole collection, and I have seen the reactions of Chinese individuals, for instance, the Bern exhibition, some were moved to tears. They said, I have never seen this. This is like my whole life I can read in these works. And I didn't know that it's better than any book, any article. So in that sense, it mirrors the society. But your question is, of course, does it also influence society? And I think there are artists like maybe Ai Weiwei who had a deep impact on parts of the Chinese society. The ones who were on the net, who had access to the web, who were not depending on the official media. So there are artists who can have a strong impact, I think, but there are no rules. Yeah.
Please, I'll give you the mic.
Hello, thank you so much for this presentation. I was very happy to hear about your collection in this way. You mentioned something that strongly resonated with me when you were talking about the difficulty of, how it was difficult actually to convince Western institutions and professionals to develop interest in Chinese contemporary art that you were collecting, that you were living with, and that you were supporting. And my question goes into, as a Westerner with a strong interest in non-Western artistic practice, as for China, how did you feel in this work of convincing and educating that you did successfully over the years, and how do you understand this super kind of supremacy that Western institutions keep, and the lack of, interest, and the continuation of, how can I put it, excuses not to do?
Well, so all of a sudden I changed sides by my exposure to Chinese art and by seeing this multitude of very interesting and good artists who just didn't have access to this global art operating system, to the big biennales and the documentas, etc. And they were focused mainly on what I call NATO art. The NATO countries really also dominated the art scene. But we see this, I think, gradually softening. I mean, you're one of the people who contribute to this. So we see it softening, but it's not a fast process. And there is a lot of very good art which just doesn't make it for lack of information, lack of access, and lack of understanding by these gatekeepers who are still predominantly Western people. So that's how I felt about it. I wasn't aware of it before, like end of the 70s, before I started to look at the Chinese contemporary art, but then became fully aware of it after experiencing myself these issues.
I would like to come back in respect of the overview that you gave before certain metamorphoses in the artists in China. And so I think it's also development in the art curator. And maybe they also will go in a way which is not compatible with your view. And I don't know what you think about that. And I also would like to touch a little bit upon the collectors in China. Are there more collectors? How do they collect? And what do you think about the future of the Chinese collectors?
Well, the community of collectors is rapidly increasing. The older generation of collector, maybe they are now in their 50s, who built over the last very few years major collections of Chinese contemporary art. They were, say, individuals that came to great wealth over a short period of time. They had no interest, no exposure to contemporary art until 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And all of a sudden they got, how to say, inflamed by this and start to collect. They focus very much on painting. They still can almost not accept that a photography is of value because they don't trust it. Like in our part of the world, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they focused until very recently on Chinese contemporary art because they felt at least this happens in their own country, not that they would fully understand, but Western contemporary art even much further from their understanding. So we see that generation. Some of them dropped out all of a sudden. They opened museums, and after 2 years, they hang out with some filmmaker, and the money goes there, and the museum is closed, everything is sold. And others have now turned to Western art. And they massively start to look at Western art for various reasons. One reason, they discovered that Chinese art, from being very, very cheap as an international standard, became actually quite expensive, and they could buy a lot of good art for the same money. And others for more status, because now all of a sudden it becomes more fancy to own Western art. So I see a big change occurring, which is probably even more trendy very soon. And then we have a few mega collectors buying Van Gogh and Picasso and the like. Of course, they have absolutely no knowledge of Western art history. It's more the glamour, it's the auction situation which they love. Actually, the Chinese collectors until recently bought most in auction, preferably in auction. They don't trust the gallerists, they don't trust the gallery pricing. They think, you get this price and I get another price. While in the auction, it's visible, even though they all cheat in the auction. I'm now talking about Chinese auction houses. I hope I don't hurt anyone here. So it's it's in flux, the whole collector situation. But it clearly becomes prestigious and desirable to own contemporary art and to show it.
Back to the artists. You cannot generalize, of course, but are they are they self-taught? Or are there schools? Or is there a tradition of, let's say, in the sense of Senate craftsmanship or beyond the intermediation or before,
China had and has today a very elaborate art education system, but there is a big gap. During Cultural Revolution, they all closed down. So after Cultural Revolution, the very first generation had a lot of self-taught artists. But now the academies feed thousands of people into art production. Actually, it has become highly desirable to go to an art academy because due to the Chinese education system, if you don't make it into a university, you are a nothing in today's society. And it has become very difficult due to high requirements in natural sciences, etc., to join many universities, while the art academy doesn't require that. So there are many art academies and there are many, many, many people studying art with maybe lesser talent. So this is a big, big change. But until very recently, the whole education system was purely skill-based. So even if you will look at some of these works, I mean, if you take photorealism, there's nobody who is better at that, to paint something really fully real. So the skill is extremely high, but of course doesn't mean you have the art thinking. The art thinking, due to ideological issues, couldn't really be taught in the academies until very recently. So this is somehow the situation. So now you have less and less self-taught artists, but there's a lot of highly skilled, technically skilled artists in China.
Okay, so we probably have to come to an end soon. I think you had another question, but maybe somebody else still wants to put a question. Oh, very good, thank you. In this case, Uli, I have a last question. 10 years ago, you mentioned already this landmark exhibition, Mahjong, here in Bern, which traveled then to other countries as a kind of overview exhibition. You asked the participating, I think, around 40 artists of different generations about what is to them Chineseness. You got very diverse answers, contradicting answers. If you would ask the same question to these artists today, what do you think how they would interpret Chineseness today?
Well, out of about 75 participating artists, 40 responded.
Okay.
And I think today they would at least understand the question. At the time they didn't. They said, what a stupid question. I'm a Chinese, what I do is Chinese art. They were not really aware of that there is this global art out there looking very different, and Chinese contemporary art. So in that sense, they found this is a strange question. Some artists wrote back to me exactly mirroring the same questions. Is there Swissness in Swiss art? Do you purposely use Swissness in your art, or is it not relevant? Is stupid question, just as I asked them. So there are many different ways at the time, no consensus. What this is, how would they respond today? They would, I think they would be in a more difficult situation than they were, because as I discussed, on one hand there is this global mainstream, which they now know, which some of them actually want to join. And then there is this other part of the artist community who feels that's not the future. The future is actually our own roots. And we have to be artists by difference. And yeah, they work hard on this difference, like we talk about this traditional, or exhibitions about tradition, where some artists, they told me, well, I revisited my tradition and it's just a beautiful dream. It doesn't tell me anything. And others would say, oh, it's a dead body, you know, forget it and do some other things. And then there are those who say, actually, it's a treasure and I want to remain in this tradition. You know, it's such a wealth, and the Chinese artists, they still feel this 5,000-year-old culture most of them as a heavy burden, some as opportunity, and this lineage thought. Our artists don't have this. We don't feel, you know, we have to sort of carry on the Swiss art, but the Chinese artists, they interestingly feel this lineage coming from tradition, but it can take many forms.
Thank you again, Uli. It was a great conversation with you. I enjoyed very much. I think I can also speak on behalf of the audience. It was really very interesting and insightful to getting all these thoughts, ideas, and I wish you for the next years, in particular in this kind of obviously difficult but interesting transition period, while the collection is still here on the ground, but at the same time already intangibly moves to Hong Kong. All the best. I know that you're still very ambitious and energetic in collecting and disseminating and also teaching us about what is contemporary Chinese art and how to understand not only art but maybe Chinese identity read through art to many institutions and audiences in Western countries. I wish you good luck. I wish you that you have institutions and partners who help you in this public intermediation, which was actually the subject of the conversation today.
Thank you.